"You're lucky to be alive, sir," the nurse said, her voice a soft murmur above the rhythmic beeping of machines. But I didn't feel lucky, because the moment I opened my eyes, I knew something was wrong. The ceiling wasn't mine, the walls, the light, the strange hum of this room, none of it belonged to the house I built with my own hands in Spokane. I could still remember every crack in the ceiling fan above my old bed, every creak in the floorboards that only I could navigate without a sound. But now, I was in a stranger's house. A rented room, a bed that smelled faintly of bleach and someone else's life. My name is James Halbrook. I'm 77 years old. I've survived a war, outlived most of my friends, and worked the same welding job for 42 years without a complaint. But nothing prepared me for the pain of waking up and realizing I had lost everything without ever leaving the bed. 2 months earlier, I'd slipped into a coma after a stroke. That's what they told me. No memory, just darkness, then light. But while I lay in that darkness, my wife of nearly 4 decades had sold our home, and used the money not for my care, not to save our future, but to erase the gambling debts of her grown stepson. Her stepson, not mine. I raised him, paid for his summer camps, bought his first used car, and yet, in the end, she chose him over me, and did it in silence. No one told me until I was stable enough to walk again. Until I was strong enough to feel the full weight of betrayal. "Where's my house?" I asked, my voice scratchy and thin. The nurse shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, it's best you speak with your wife." I did, or at least, I tried. She came in 3 days later. Her face was calm, untouched by guilt. She sat down next to my bed like nothing had changed. "I had to sell it, James," she said. "The bills were piling up. And Michael, he was drowning. He needed help, but I was in that house," I said. "That was our home." She shrugged. "You were in a coma. I thought you might never come back." I stared at her, searching her eyes for even a flicker of regret. There was none, only tiredness, and something colder. "I would have rather lost everything than lost your trust," I whispered. But I already had. The house I built after we married in 1983, sold. The retirement I saved so carefully, liquidated. The heirlooms from my mother's side, gone. All to rescue a man who had never once visited me in the hospital, not even when I was on life support. And now, I was renting a room in a stranger's house in Kennewick, Washington. A fold-out cot, my toiletries in a plastic bag, a single chair by the window where I sit every morning and ask myself one question over and over. How could someone love you for 40 years, and still do this? They say betrayal hurts more when it comes from someone close. But no one tells you it's not just the betrayal, it's the silence, the choices made in your absence, and the realization that your love story was never quite what you thought it was. And that's how it begins. Not with a loud argument, not with a dramatic reveal, but with quiet abandonment while you were asleep. I met Diane at a 4th of July parade in Yakima in 1980. She was standing under a sycamore tree with a sparkler in one hand and a laughing boy in the other, her stepson, Michael. Widowed young, she carried a kind of sadness behind her smile, a gentleness that made you want to protect her. I thought I could. I was 32, a welder for the railroads, the kind of man who showed up early and never called in sick. I wasn't flashy, but I was solid, dependable. I'd been raised on peanut butter sandwiches and war stories from my father, a man who taught me that showing up, really showing up, was the truest form of love. We married the next spring. I moved them into my home just outside Spokane, a modest 2-bedroom with a sagging fence and a garden full of weeds. But I rebuilt it with my own hands, painted every wall, laid new floors, even planted apple trees in the back because Diane once said she loved the smell of them in bloom. Michael was only 8. His own father had died in a logging accident, and he was still wet with grief when I stepped in. At first, he barely looked me in the eye, but I made his lunch every morning, helped him with math, taught him how to change oil and hold a wrench. I never once raised my voice to him. I thought that counted for something. Years passed. We celebrated anniversaries with steak on the grill and cheap red wine. We never traveled far. Money was always tight, but we made do. I took overtime to cover Michael's braces. I sold my fishing boat so Diane could go back to school for a year, though she eventually dropped out. I didn't mind. I remember one winter, we were snowed in for 2 days and lost power. Diane and I lit every candle in the house, made cocoa from powdered milk, and told stories until morning. She fell asleep on my shoulder, and I remember thinking, this is all I ever wanted. A home, someone to share it with. But what I didn't see back then, what I refused to see, was how much she still held onto the past. Her first husband, Mark, was always brave, always strong, always such a good father. At first, I nodded along, not wanting to compete with a dead man. But the stories never stopped. He was the first photo on the mantle. His wedding ring stayed in her jewelry box. His fishing rod stayed in our garage, untouched but never thrown out. I told myself it was normal. I convinced myself I was building something new, that she'd heal over time. But time didn't change what lived in her heart. And Michael, as he got older, he drifted. Failed out of community college. Got arrested for drunk driving. Came back home, left again, took money, borrowed tools, never said thank you. Diane always forgave him. I always paid the bills. Still, I loved her. I really did. I thought loyalty meant staying even when it got hard. I thought love meant patience. But I was wrong, because while I gave her my years, she was quietly saving her heart for ghosts. And while I thought we were building a future together, she was always looking backward, back to a life before me, back to a man I could never be. I didn't see it then. I didn't want to. But now, from this rented room in a stranger's house, every memory has a different shape. And every quiet moment we shared feels less like intimacy and more like absence in disguise. You'd be amazed how many signs a man can ignore when he loves too much and speaks too little. The little things started disappearing first. She stopped calling me hon around the time she turned 65. Just stopped cold one day, like she didn't remember I had once been the man who held her hand through chemotherapy when they feared a lump on her thyroid. She said it was nothing. Just age, just moods, just being tired. The home we built, the walls I patched, the porch I stained every spring, slowly became hers. I'd hear it in conversations with friends on the phone. My house, she'd say. My mortgage, as if I hadn't refinanced my pension into that place when the market crashed in 2008 to save us from drowning. And then came Michael, her son in blood, not mine in spirit. He came around more often once Diane got older. To help, he said. Though somehow, helping always meant putting his name on our accounts. Suggesting I step back, advising Diane to handle things while I rest. He'd sit in the recliner I bought, drinking the beer I paid for, saying things like, "Pops, you're lucky Mom still puts up with you." He said it with a smirk, not cruelty. That's what made it worse. He didn't need to scream. Mockery does its damage with a whisper. And Diane, she'd chuckle, not loudly, but she chuckled. I started sleeping in the den. Said it was for my back. Truth is, I stopped wanting to lie beside someone who had slowly begun treating me like a guest in the house I kept warm for decades. Once, when I brought home a bouquet of those same lilies she adored when we first met, she barely looked up from her crossword. "Flowers, now?" she said. "What are you feeling guilty about?" Guilty? I didn't even know how to answer. I stood there holding the stems like some kid caught stealing from the pantry. I left them in the kitchen sink. They wilted by morning. She didn't notice. When I asked if we could go visit the Cascades again, just one weekend, like we used to, she said the stairs were too much for her knees. Then she went on a road trip with her book club 3 weeks later. I stayed home, feeding the cat she loved more than conversation. And still, I stayed, because what do you do when you're 70 and the woman you married at 33 starts looking at you like she's waiting for you to finish your sentence? I thought maybe she was grieving. Maybe she was afraid of growing old. Maybe Michael was filling her head with nonsense, telling her she deserved freedom and space and a new chapter. I'd hear them whisper sometimes in the kitchen. She stopped leaving bills on the counter. She started locking drawers that had always stayed open. She stopped looking me in the eye. And I stopped asking why. But the final crack, the one that didn't just split me, but hollowed me, came 6 months before her stroke. She had a manila envelope on the table. I wasn't trying to pry, but my name was on it, and the flap was half open. Inside were papers, deeds, account statements, insurance adjustments, and none of them listed me as a primary anything. Not even as her husband. She walked in, caught me holding it, and her face didn't flush or falter. She just said, "You shouldn't go through things that aren't yours." Not ours, not mine, things that aren't yours. I didn't speak, I didn't argue, I didn't cry, I just nodded, and set the envelope down like it was made of glass and gilt. That night, I slept in the garage. Not because I had to, but because I realized I already lived there, in the forgotten corners of her life. The saddest part, I still brought her tea the next morning. Sugar, no honey, just like always, because I had learned, after so many years of quiet rejection, that sometimes the only way to love someone is silently. Even when they've long since stopped loving you back. They say the dead can't betray you, but sometimes, they can leave behind maps of betrayal so meticulously drawn, you wonder if they ever really loved you at all. It happened 3 weeks after Diane's funeral. The ache was still fresh, so fresh I couldn't sit on her side of the bed without hearing the phantom rustle of her quilted robe. I'd kept her slippers beside the nightstand. Couldn't throw them out, couldn't even touch them. Michael came by with his usual false charm. "Hey, Pop," he said, voice smooth as a politician. "We gotta talk through some of the legal stuff, now that Mom's gone." He brought coffee, just the way I liked it. I should have known then. We sat in the living room, sunlight filtering through the curtains she picked out in 1999. I hadn't touched a thing in that house since her death. Not even the TV remote. It felt like cheating. Michael opened a binder. New, sleek, expensive looking. "Now, before we go to the notary, I want you to know that Mom made her own decisions." All right, that's when I felt it. That subtle shift in the air. Like a cold front moving through a summer room. "She updated the will 2 years ago," he continued. "After you had that surgery. Remember? You were out for almost 2 weeks. She got worried, thought it was time to make some decisions." I stared at him. I thought we had a joint trust. We set that up in 2004. He flipped a page toward me. "She revoked it." The words hit like bricks thrown underwater. No splash, just pressure, building and building, pressing down on my chest. He continued, calm as a clerk. "She transferred the house into her sole name. Sold it last year, paid off some debts. Left the rest of the assets to me and to someone else." My breath caught. "Someone else?" He cleared his throat. "Edgar." The name punched through the air like a ghost breaking through drywall. Edgar Rhodes. Her first love. The man from her youth she used to refer to as that mistake from Austin. The one she swore she hadn't spoken to in 40 years. Apparently, she had, for decades. There were letters, emails, photos. My wife of 48 years had kept in touch with a man she told me had broken her heart. And now, even in death, she gave him a part of what we built together. The final insult? Michael didn't even look ashamed. "Look, Pop, it's done. You're still in the will, just not as much. She figured you'd be okay." She figured I'd be okay? I didn't realize I'd said it out loud. He nodded, as if that was a kindness. "Yeah," she said, "you're resourceful, independent. You didn't need much. I, who had emptied my pension to keep her comfortable. I, who had changed her bedpans when cancer nearly won. I, who made her laugh through menopause, and cried when she cried the night her mother died. I didn't need much." That night, I went to the file cabinet in the garage, the one I hadn't opened in years. I pulled out the trust papers. The original ones. The ones with both our names, side by side, like two halves of a promise. And then I pulled the recent ones, the ones Michael had handed me, and laid them out like a coroner matching bones. The truth was in the dates, the signatures, the shifting of names and power. It had all been redrawn while I was under anesthesia 3 years ago, recovering from a surgery that might have taken me away. While I slept, they rewrote my life. And the saddest thing, I didn't feel rage. I felt erased. I poured myself a drink I hadn't touched in decades. Sat on the porch, listened to the wind brush through the pine trees. And I made a vow. Not one of violence, not even of confrontation, but of clarity. They had taken from me. But they had forgotten one thing. You don't bury a man like me with a pen. You just wake him up. I began with a trip to the courthouse in Coma. Nothing dramatic, just a slow walk under gray Washington skies, the kind that always feel like they're holding back tears. I wore my old corduroy jacket and brought a folder tucked under my arm, filled with documents from a life I thought was shared. I didn't tell Michael. I didn't tell anyone. The clerk was young, kind, didn't blink twice when I asked about power of attorney records and deed transfers. She printed what I needed, stapled the stack, and handed it over with a neutral smile. But her eyes lingered a second longer than normal. I think she saw it. Grief hardened into quiet resolve. When I got home, I spread the paperwork on the kitchen table like puzzle pieces. It was all legal. Every betrayal, her updated will, the property sale, the accounts drained, had been done with the right forms, the right stamps, the right signatures. She had sold our home 6 months before she passed, transferred the funds to a private account in Michael's name, paid off Edgar's medical debt, even left a trust for Edgar's step-grandson, someone I'd never met. And me, I got a watch, an old one. Engraved on the back were the words, "To James, who never stopped believing in love." It wasn't even from her. It was from Edgar. She had given him my name, my loyalty, my presence, and he gave me a watch. I spent a week doing what no one expected me to do. I didn't shout, I didn't beg, I didn't write angry letters. I called Raymond, an old friend from the Navy who practiced elder law in Oregon. We hadn't spoken in 10 years. He picked up on the first ring. "Jimmy," he said. "You alive?" "Barely," I said, "but I've got some work for you." He drove up that weekend. No suit, no tie, just a man in flannel with a steel-trap mind. We went through every page, every dotted line, every dotted I. "You've got a case," he said. "Might not undo the will, but there's leverage." What kind of leverage? The kind that makes people uncomfortable. We drafted letters. We contacted the escrow company that handled the house. Turns out there were a few irregularities in how Michael pushed the sale through while I was incapacitated. A missing affidavit, a signature that didn't match Diane's earlier handwriting. Small things, but in the right hands, small things grow sharp. Raymond had a contact in local media, someone who wrote human interest stories for a community paper in Pierce County. A gentle reporter with a soft voice and a love for justice. I agreed to an anonymous interview. The headline, when it ran a few weeks later, read, "Navy veteran learns wife sold home behind his back while he was in a coma." It didn't name me, but Michael knew, and so did his circle. 2 days later, I received a call from the nursing home where I'd been moved after Diane's passing. "Mr. Wallace," the administrator said carefully, "your son stopped payments again. But we understand the circumstances now. You're covered for the next 6 months. An anonymous donor paid in full." It wasn't charity. It was fear. Fear of exposure. Fear of lawsuits. Fear that the quiet old man might be louder than they thought. Raymond advised I keep things calm. "I don't want vengeance," I told him. "Just dignity." He nodded. "Sometimes, they're the same thing." We filed a complaint to the state bar regarding Michael's handling of medical proxies and fiduciary responsibilities. That wouldn't undo the past, but it would stain his name in professional circles if he ever tried to manage anyone's affairs again. The house was gone, the savings were gone, but my silence was gone, too. And that, to a man like me, was everything. I had been made to feel like a shadow. But now, I was the wind behind a closed door. The kind you can't see but that rattles the frame until the hinges remember how to creak. I didn't send Michael a warning. I didn't even tell him I knew. That was the worst part for him, I think, not knowing what I would do or when. Weeks passed, then a month. I lived quietly, still at the small house of the woman who'd taken me in during the storm of my return. Her name was Linda. She had been a nurse once, now retired, widowed. She cooked in silence and set the table with 2 forks even when I didn't have the appetite to eat. "Do you want me to say something to him?" she asked one evening, when I showed her the newspaper article. I used to know people at Channel 5. I shook my head. No, if I speak, it's not to get attention. It's to end things. And quietly, things did end. Michael received a formal letter from the court, informing him that he was being investigated for financial misrepresentation concerning elder care arrangements. He didn't respond, not at first. Then, 3 weeks later, he showed up at the door of Linda's house. It was raining. Funny how rain has a way of washing faces clean. His looked smaller than I remembered. His eyes were red, but not from guilt, from fear. "Dad," he said, "I need to talk." Linda stood behind me. I didn't ask her to leave. I didn't offer him coffee. I stepped onto the porch. He stayed 2 steps back, like I was some brittle porcelain that might shatter. "They're digging through everything," he stammered. "My firm is panicking. They said I could lose my license." I nodded slowly. The wind blew his wet shirt against his ribs like paper. "I didn't know Diane had done it behind your back," he said. "She told me you agreed. That it was what you wanted." I looked at him, not with anger, but with the quiet disappointment that hangs heavier than rage. "And when I woke up?" I asked. "When I had no bed, no home, and a mountain of unpaid bills." He didn't answer. "You didn't think that maybe something wasn't right?" I thought it would hurt you more if you knew. So I just kept the account closed. I thought you'd be better off not remembering." I stared at him a long time. And then I said the truest thing I'd spoken in years. "You didn't protect me. You erased me." He opened his mouth again, but I raised a hand. "I don't want your apology. I don't want your explanations. I want you to leave, and I want you to know you no longer have a father." It wasn't loud, it wasn't cruel, but it landed like a stone. He looked at me like a boy who dropped something he didn't know how to fix. "I'm still your son." "No," I said, turning back toward the door. "You were once." That night, Linda poured me a cup of coffee and placed it gently by my side. "You did what you had to do," she whispered. "No," I said, "I did what he made me do." It's strange how betrayal doesn't always look like a knife. It can be a closed door, a silence when someone should have spoken, a signature on a dotted line. But justice doesn't have to scream. Sometimes, it's just a man saying no more and meaning it. And for the first time in years, I slept through the night without dreaming of locked doors or lost time. I live now in Sequim, Washington. The salt air here is different than what I remember in Olympia, softer, quieter. The people at the market still smile and ask about the weather like it matters, and the woman who runs the bakery always slips me a second roll by accident. Linda and I aren't a couple, exactly. But she's here, and I'm here, and we sit beside each other when the wind gets loud. My days are slow, but not empty. I wake early, brew strong coffee, walk past the hedges the neighbor trims too often. I write things no one will read. Sometimes, I watch the seagulls swirl above the cliffs and wonder if they remember where they came from. Or if the wind simply carries them forward without question. My name is not on any deed anymore. There is no property waiting for me in my children's future. I am not part of a legacy. But in a strange way, I've found something better: peace. People ask sometimes, how could you not forgive them? How can you hold that bitterness and not let it eat you alive? But what they don't understand is this. Forgiveness isn't forgetting. Forgiveness isn't pretending it didn't happen. Forgiveness isn't turning a scar into a smile. What they did, what my wife did, wasn't a mistake. It was a choice to sell the only place I called home, while I was unconscious, to clean up debts that weren't mine. A choice to leave me in a stranger's living room, waking to fluorescent light and the echo of wheels I didn't recognize. And my son, the boy I once taught how to fish, how to drive, he let it happen. He watched me unravel and didn't even bring a blanket. I don't hate them. That would give them too much space in my chest. I've simply erased them. Their numbers are no longer in my phone. Their names, no longer in my will. I mailed a notarized letter to the courthouse last fall, revoking every legal tie we once shared. They will hear about me next only when a death notice arrives, and even then, it will not come with guilt, because I expect none from them. I've made peace with the truth. Sometimes, you are the placeholder in someone else's story, the step between what they wanted and what they settled for. I was never her home. I was her hiding place. And when she didn't need me to hide anymore, she gave away the walls. But I've built a new home now. Not of wood or brick, but of solitude, dignity, and quiet mornings untouched by lies. If you've been betrayed like I have, if you've been forgotten by the people you built your life around, you are not broken, you are not finished, you are free, and sometimes, freedom begins with saying this one thing, calmly, clearly, and finally. You don't get to hurt me again. That's how I ended it. Not with revenge, not with rage, but with a door that I closed and never reopened.